Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harita Balakrishnan, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all of you to today's ICS Wednesday seminar. Our topic for today is Interpreting the Translated, Mo Yan's PN across Chinese, English, and Hindi. Translation lies at the center of how literature travels across cultures. But what happens when this journey passes through an intermediary language rather than directly from the original? This practice, known as relay translation, opens up important questions about fidelity, authorship, and cultural transfer. Today's seminar explores these issues through a comparative study of Mo Yan's novella, PN, its English translation changed by Howard Goldblatt, and the Hindi version, Tum Aur Voh Truck, translated by Pushpesh Pant. Using a descriptive translation studies framework, this seminar undertakes a three-way comparison of PN, focusing particularly on its Hindi translation. The discussion explores how meaning shifts in this version through changes in the title, cover, proper nouns, and regional idioms when it is translated via English rather than directly from Chinese. This analysis highlights how relay translation reshapes meaning, adjusts tone, and negotiates cultural context by tracing how PN is reinterpreted in Hindi through its English intermediary. The seminar emphasizes the role of translators in shaping literary reception and shows how the global circulation of literature often relies on such layered and asymmetrical processes of mediation. Our speaker today is Dr. Nishit Kumar, a trained sinologist with a PhD in Chinese from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His doctoral research, China and the Nobel Prize, Reception and Impact of the Literature Prize to Mo Yan, explored the intersections of literature, translation, and cultural politics. He was awarded the ICS HYI Multi-Year Doctoral Fellowship in China Studies, which enabled him to pursue research at Peking University and Harvard University. His recent publications examine themes such as the reception of Chinese and Indian literature in the world literary canon and Howard Goldblatt's translations of Mo Yan's works. Chairing today's seminar is Professor Shabri Mitra, Professor of Chinese at Jawaharlal Nehru University and Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Her research spans contemporary Chinese literature and criticism, cultural history, gender issues, and India-China cultural relations. She is also the editor of China Report, the ICS quarterly journal published by Sage. Her most recent publication is an edited volume titled China's May 4th Movement, New Narratives and Perspectives, published by Routledge in 2023. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to remind participants of a few housekeeping rules. All attendees shall remain muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand option during the interactive session, after which you will be invited to unmute yourself. Thank you. With that, I now hand over to Professor Mitra. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Harita. Thank you, ICS, for inviting me to chair this particular Wednesday seminar. And I'm looking forward to an interesting presentation by Nishit. And I'm interested in Nishit's work for the simple reason that he's working in an area which is not well trodden within India. So I would begin by flagging a few issues before I hand over to Nishit. So why is Indian scholarly interest in Chinese literature in general and Mo Yan in particular important for us to consider? We know that as far as Chinese literature is concerned, an informed, educated, urban Indian would have heard the name of Lu Xun. A lot of people of our generation would have read Lu Xun. But I wonder whether or not many of the Indian young scholars or young students of even Indian literature would have heard or read much about Chinese literature. So the other point is very important because Nguyen received the Literature Nobel in 2012, exactly 100 years after the first Literature Nobel was awarded to an Asian writer when Tagore was bestowed with this honor. And it is important to note that this journey of 100 years for Asia, especially in the context of Literature Nobel, has been an interesting one. I don't want to get into the details of that. However, two things that are important to note is that in this interim, the Indian writers have actually been awarded several internationally renowned literary awards. And in fact, the Chinese scholars of Indian literature have always wondered about this. But on the other hand, I heard somebody lamenting the point that we have not had a literature Nobel since our independence. The other point is really, which Nishit has worked on for his thesis, is how China has been very, very focused on getting a Nobel and especially a literature Nobel. So this is about why I think Indian scholars looking at Chinese literature and Nguyen is important. Also because that we represent another ancient civilization, and there have been many similarities and many points of competition, if I may say so, between India and China. So the other point, which is a larger point, which I'm putting it here more by way of a backdrop as a context, should the reception of Nguyen be viewed as the periphery moving towards the center? Or what was the political appropriation of the literary stature that Chinese fiction gained by this first ever highest recognition, which is connected with the earlier point that I made? Could one say that world literature would start looking at Chinese writings as a part of its literary center? In this context, it's also important that we are looking at Indian translation, even if it's a secondary or tertiary translation of Nguyen's novel, because Nguyen's writing or any other Chinese writing for, as it were, but that in the context of a cultural hegemony of the West in creating labels and stereotypes, how does a recognition and further translation and dissemination and reception of an Asian writer uh, is seen in another Asian culture? And how does that contribute to this whole question of how the periphery are we helping in the periphery moving to the center? So this is my second point. That the last point that I would like to make is that, as we know, that literary spaces are crafted and produced, and how their production transform a cultural geography of a country, and we could extend it by saying the cultural geography of a region. But it is important to note in the Indian context that this novella has been translated into Hindi. Nishit can tell us how many other Indian languages this novella or any other particular work of Nguyen have been translated within India. So it is then interesting to note whether it informs this whole question of transforming cultural geography of Asia. So with that, I think I hand over to Nishit. Nishit, you have about 30 to 35 minutes to make your presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving the ground for my presentation. I feel especially humbled and privileged to present at today's ICS Wednesday seminar. I would like to sincerely thank the director of ICS, Alka ma'am, for her constant support and encouragement, and also the coordinators of ICS, Sheetal, Snigdha, and Harita, for giving the introduction and putting the abstract in front of audience. And I'm grateful to all of you who have taken the time to join this session, and I look forward to your comment and feedback. Let me start with sharing my presentation. I hope the presentation is visible to everyone.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so this is the story of a novella, Biàn, which was originally written in Chinese, set up in Kaomi with the flavor of Santung province of China. How it traveled the world and in Hindi became Tum Aur Voh Truck. So in this presentation, I will explore this fascinating journey. This journey offers a window into translation as a cultural negotiation and not just a linguistic act. Let me begin by briefly outlining my presentation. This is the outline, starting from introduction of the writer, translator, then the theory or the framework which this presentation is based on, and then the original text, what are my findings, and then I will provide the conclusion. So as I have outlined the structure, let me turn to the author himself first, because he's a very well-known author in the world, but still I feel a lot of Indian audience has not yet be very much familiar with him. So he was born in a peasant family in Santung province. The hallmark of his writing is that he combines literary style with popular oral traditions to address contemporary social issues. He initially received his recognition through Changi's Mo's movie, Hung Kaoliang, based on his novel of the same name, Hung Kaoliang, Chiatsu. Instant success of the film in the domestic circle and also at the international stage brought attention on Moyen's works. His works started getting translated into other various European and Asian languages. As his works were being translated into French and English, he probably gained more attention in the West, more than even within China. Many scholars believe that it was his translator, Howard Goldblatt, who brought Moyen's work into the international limelight. In his works, Moyen portrayed the blur between past and present, dead and living, good and bad. He has also often satirized the communist society in his own style. That's why sometimes his works were banned. His works were largely influenced by Lucian socialist realism and Gabriel Garcia Marquez' magical realism. In 2012, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Now, the next one is his official English translator. Moyen's work has also been translated by other authors, but Moyen himself said in various interviews that his official translator is Howard Goldblatt. Howard Goldblatt is arguably the most prolific and influential American translator of Chinese literature and even the literature of our time. He has produced generations of English readers to a wide spectrum of contemporary Chinese language literature and brought translated Chinese literature from the confines of academia into the mainstream. Now, the next is his Hindi translator, Pushpesh Pant. He is a noted Indian academic, food critic, and historian. He was a colleague of our professors. He was a professor of international relation in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has authored many bestseller books like The Cookbook, which was also named by the New York Times as one of the best cookbooks of the year in 2011. In 2016, the government of India awarded him the Padma Shri. Now that we know about Moyen, his translators, it is important to explain how this research approaches their work. Before turning to the text, I will briefly introduce the concept of relay translation and will outline the framework I use to study these texts. So relay translation in layman term is like copying a photocopy of a painting. What will be the result? Maybe some details fade and some may change also. So the Hindi version of Biàn, Hum Tum Aur Voh Truck, is not a direct translation from Chinese. Instead, it was translated from Goldblatt's English version. And this process is called as relay translation or indirect translation. Relay translation is very common in world literature. especially for the text in languages which are considered less globally dominant. For example, many Japanese and Russian works reach Indian readers through English. Relay translations make literature accessible, but it also creates layers of interpretation. In this context, my research focuses on these layers and asks the research question: how does Moyan's voice transform as it moves through English into Hindi? To study this, I use Descriptive Translation Studies, which was developed by Gideon Torrey. Gideon Torrey was an Israeli translation scholar and professor of poetics, comparative literature, and translation studies, and a pioneer of descriptive translation studies. DTS does not ask if a translation is faithful. Most of the other translation theory talk about faithfulness and fidelity. But DTS examines how translations work in their new cultural context. This framework helps me to trace not just what changes, but why it changes, revealing the power of translators as cultural interpreters. This study focused on three areas. One is paratextual elements, meaning things like titles, cover page, blurbs, forewords, all of these which shape readers' expectations even before they start reading the actual text. The second focus area is cultural shifts, how local references or humor are adopted in the new text, and also the linguistic shifts, how words, syntax, idioms changes in the translated text or the target text. Let us now turn to the text itself. So Biàn was first published as a short story in People's Literature in 2009 and later expanded into a novella and published by Dolphin Press or Haithun Chu Pansha in 2010. In an interview which I conducted with Moyan, he recalled that during a visit to Italy to receive the Nonino Literary Award, he met a representative from a small publishing house in Kolkata. He was not able to take the name of Seagull Press, Seagull Books, but he did mention that a small publishing house. Let's hear from himself.
出版社也曾经跟我联系过，在什么加尔各答的一家出版社。他好像出过我的41胖吧，好像也出过我的一个很短的一个小中篇叫《变》，带点自传性质的。这是那个共产党主义考虑的。是一家出版社，很小的出版社。因为有一年我去意大利领取这个诺尼诺奖的时候，这一个印度这家出版社这个一个摄影的他在，后来跟我建立了联系，然后让我给他专门写一篇文章，写一个18000字的文章，我把它写长了，后来他变成了一本书。我也不知道这个，就是说这个。
So what Moyan is saying in this video is that because of maybe a few readers, a few audience has not knowledge of Chinese language. So quote unquote, a publishing house in Kolkata seems to have published my 41 Canyons, one of his novels, and also published my short novel Change. It is a small publishing house. When I went to Italy to receive Nonino Literary Award, he went there in 2005, a photographer from an Indian publishing house, though he was actually the publisher Naveen Kishore, but holding a camera. He asked him to write an article, a 10,000 word article, and the writing has grown into a book as Biàn. So Biàn is set in rural Santung, Kaumi province. It talks about Moyan's own memoir when he was a small child, studying in 5th grade. And these are the pictures from Moyan's village. The first picture is his primary school from Kaumi. Then the board of the section B of 5th standard, his classroom, and then his home. So it recounts Moyan's childhood memories and also fascination about his own classmates by using humor and also reflect China's rapid social transformation. He also talks about kind of a satire on Chinese Communist Party and the rule at that time. So what are my findings from the text? So first, is about title. One of the clearest signs of how a story changes in translation is in its title. In Chinese, Biàn, the middle text is Chinese version. On the left one is English, and on the right one is Hindi version. So in Chinese, Biàn is just one character meaning change. It is abstract, philosophical, and perfectly in tune with how Moyans write, which often blends memory and history with a reflective tone. In English, Howard Goldblatt's change retains this simplicity. The design of the English edition is a little different, but also understated, positioning Moyan as a serious literary author for an international audience. The Hindi title, however, is strikingly different. Hum Tum Aur Voh Truck, literally meaning you, me, and that truck. It feels narrative, playful, and even cinematic. How cinematic? Because in Bollywood we already have a few movies which was released with almost similar name, featuring Ashok Kumar and Vinod Khanna movie of 1971, Hum Tum Aur Voh. Then 2004's movie, Saif Ali Khan and Rani Mukherjee's Hum Tum. So these transformation is not just linguistic. It shows how titles act as paratexts that frame readers' expectations. Before opening the book, a Hindi reader is already primed for a lighter, more familiar tone with contrast with the original's reflective mood. The second observation is about cover design. And this is one of my key findings from a close reading of the book covers and how each edition visually frames the story for its readers. The Chinese edition is simple and plain, signaling a serious literary work rooted in a Chinese context. The English edition, published as part of What Was Communism, a series edited by Tariq Ali, is rich with political imagery, lanterns, you can see a red star, a lion, glimpse of Mao era propaganda poster, Mao shaking hands with a Stalin, a child soldier, and a traditional Chinese architectural motifs. This design clearly situates the novella within a historical and political discourse for an international audience. However, in contrast, the Hindi edition is strikingly different, featuring a bright, bold truck illustration with a yin-yang symbol and the humorous slogan at the back, Dipper Maar Ho Ja Paar, a very familiar phrase painted on Indian trucks. The vibrant, playful design reflects how the publisher wanted to market this novella as a popular, accessible story rather than a serious literary work. These covers are not merely decorative, they are paratexts that frame how readers in different cultural contexts perceive Moyan's narrative before even turning the first page. When we turn the first page, we either found author's note, some forward in Hindi prastavna, or translator's note. So in Chinese original version, Moyans begins with a deeply personal note recounting how this novella came to be, something which we just heard from Moyan himself. And then this anecdote captures not only the origins of Biàn, but also the network of international relationships behind its publication. In English version, this context disappears completely. Instead, the book opens with a general editorial preface, What Was Communism by Tariq Ali, situating the novella in a broader exploration of 20th century communism. Moyan's personal reflection is absent, and there is no translator's note by Howard Goldblatt, which he usually put in other works. The Hindi edition takes yet another approach. It opens with a powerful foreword by renowned writer Uday Prakash, who emphasizes how deeply personal memories are also profoundly political. He draws parallel between Moyan's memoir-like a storytelling, spanning from 1969 to 79, then from 1989 to 2009. And he also talks about India's own socio-political experiences and how it can be compared with China, and thus describe the novella as a chronicle of China's transformation. Then the Hindi translators note also emphasize their decision to take certain liberties with the text to maintain reader engagement, and also explicitly acknowledging the creative role of translation These differences reveal how paratexts are used to reshape the narrative for each audience. This reinforces a central argument of my research that translation is never just linguistic. It is also editorial, interpretive, and political. Now let's move to the next part, which is about cultural references. One of the most revealing aspects of this study is how cultural references shift across the Chinese, English, and Hindi version of Biàn. So in front of you, there is a table of Chinese version, English version, and Hindi version with page number and how it changes. So the very first example about ping pong. Usually in India, whoever play table tennis, they don't say ping pong. It is a word, it is basically a word of American English. And why it has been translated even in Hindi as ping pong? Because it was translated from English version to Hindi version. Then, Moyen's narrative is rich with references deeply embedded in Chinese culture. Festivals like Kuo Qing Chie, National Day, iconic revolutionary songs like Tung Fang Hong, and well-known literary classics like San Kuo Yani, Hung Lo Meng, and Shi Yao Chi. However, these references are carefully explained in English version, where Howard Goldblatt often adds clarifying phrases such as calling Chang Fei a Han Dynasty heroic figure to make the text accessible for English readers. However, the Hindi version takes an even more interpretive approach, and Chang Fei is described as Bhim Jaise Pahalwan, a wrestler as strong as Bhim from Mahabharata, drawing a deliberate connection to Indian mythology. Similarly, the revolutionary anthem, The East is Red, is rendered as Purab Hai Lal, explicitly labeled as a Qaumi Tarana or a national song, giving it a local resonance. Proper nouns also shift meanings. Names like Liu Tianquang, Lu Wenlei, He Zhu, Tu Baohua, Kaomi, etc. These choices demonstrate a double movement of cultural adaptation. The English edition tends to neutralize Chinese cultural specificity through explanatory strategies, while the Hindi edition domesticates the text, embedding Chinese references into Indian cultural frameworks. This highlights how translation is not simply a transfer of meaning, but a negotiation between cultural systems, shaping how readers in different linguistic worlds relate to Moyen's narrative. For example, Tang Ping was in English version getting into People's Liberation Army. In Hindi text, People's Liberation Army was translated in first and second chapter as Jan Mukti Sena, but later it becomes a transliteration as People's Liberation Army in page number 45. Now let's move to the observation on linguistic shifts from Chinese to Hindi by intermediary English. So in front of you, there are some observation about idiomatic substitution, lexical generalization, changes in metaphors, also tone softening, pragmatic omissions, and lexical modernization. So if in Chinese it is qie shang shang, in English version it becomes my heart in my throat, something to shy away or to feel fearful. In Hindi, it was simple, darte darte. The same way, the Chinese version of Yuan Zi de You Bian有一个用转头和水泥建成的简易乒乓球台. It was simply translated as a simple concrete table on a brick stand, or concrete की बनी ईंटों पर टिकी मेज, a place where people were playing table tennis. Then Hama was translated in Hindi once as a hippo and then later as Hama. Also toad. Toad is not the similar as frog, but it was translated as medak in throughout the text. Then there were pragmatic omissions also done, and like lexical modernization. Now, in Hindi or general use of Hindi, we don't call or we rarely call any guy as makhan or chikna, the way it was used in Chinese or in English. Now, the next is about narrative voices. So there is one example of one of the character of this novel where Wu, the classmate of Moyan, he was supposed to go out of the classroom. He was actually directed by the teacher. So the Chinese reads as He Zhu Bao Zhe Shu Bao Chuan Cheng Yi Tuan Cong Jiao Shi Li Yi Lu Gun Chu Qu Zhuang Dao Zhuo Yi Zai Pa Qi Lai Tou Ye Bu Hui De Zou La. But in Hindi, it became Hey. First, the translation of the name, it might have been the complete translation at Hajru. The translator writes, हे लुढ़कता हुआ क्लास से बाहर निकल गया, खड़ा हुआ, मिट्टी में सना और पीछे मुड़कर एक नजर डाले बिना चलता बना. But the text, a few other elaborations are missing, which is actually the hallmark of Moyan's writing. Another example from page 21 is almost very similar, where the narration was little suppressed by the translator. Like, 那时因广山上的乒乓球 there is 上上的乒乓球 and then 金响沾了眼睛似的飞进了刘老师的嘴巴 मानो वह चमकीली गेंद अपनी आंखों से राह देखती सीधे खुले मुंह में जा घुसी. There are other examples also, like there was one instance where He, it was a personal description of He, which talks about, quote unquote, like a striding purposely, head high, chest out. He walked down the space between us, as students, and the teacher without a hint of fear. And here also the Chinese text trying to string together multiple actions, but in Hindi text it was missing. So on basis of this, I want to first summarize. First is that titles and paratexts are cultural gateways. Chinese title is abstract. Hindi title is more playful and designed to appeal the Indian readers. Covers, forewords, and notes frames are different ways in Hindi, English, and Chinese. Cultural adaptation and substitutions are done in all both the translation in English and in Hindi. Then there are presence of linguistic shifts and narrative style. So let's come back to the research question that how does Moyan's voice transform as it moves through English into Hindi? One is Moyan's original reflective, nostalgic voice becomes a smoother and more universal via translation and framed through a political lens for global readers. In Hindi, his voice takes on a new layer of intimacy and colloquial humor, resonating with Indian readers and oral storytelling traditions. The third one is the transformation highlights how voice is co-created. What Indian readers encounter is a shared creation of Moyan, Goldblatt, and Pushpesh Pant. It demonstrates the collaborative nature of world literature in translation, something which Shabri ma'am laid the ground about is periphery going towards center or center going towards periphery, and what is cultural geography. So, and also I want to give a precaution that this work is not to undermine the translator's effort, but in fact, relay translation is a vital practice. It enables the text from less globally dominant languages to reach broader audience. And I want to end this presentation with a question for food for thought for everyone. Do you think that would Moyan's work sound more Chinese if translated directly into Hindi? Or is this layered voice part of his global identity? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nishit, for a presentation that actually transcends many aspects of culture studies. Now, before we open to the listeners for questions, I was just wondering, how would you answer your question that you left the audience with? You're muted, Nishit.
Thank you, ma'am. So, in my view, absolutely, it will sound more Chinese if translated directly into Hindi, and there could be some better version. It can present a better version, like one of the translation, like Kuo Ching Chie Chi Chian. In English version, it is translated as October 1st National Day celebration. But in Hindi version, probably it may be because of some mistake, अक्टूबर में पहले राष्ट्रीय दिवस समारोह. It was not the first coaching चाहिए, but in Hindi it sounds like it was the first. The same way, like teacher Liu was become more colloquial as Liu Masa. And if we look at proper names, like Shantong has been translated as Sandong. Probably people who are not aware of the language may not be able to relate to it, but those who are aware, there is no place in China which is Sandong, or even if somebody will speak to a Chinese, it will not be Sandong. So these kind of cultural negotiations can be avoided, and it can provide a better translation.
Okay. So, Harita, are there any questions in the chat box? Otherwise, of course, the audience can use the option of raising hands and ask questions directly. Harita, are there any questions? Harita, we can't hear you.
There are no questions posted yet.
There are no questions posted as of now. Okay, so are there any other questions or comments from the audience? So, Nishit, I would like to engage you. Shruti Jargad has raised her hand. Shruti, please. Can you?
Yeah, I can unmute
Yeah,
myself
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Thank you, Nishit. That was an amazing presentation. I just had a question, two small questions, and again, not very familiar with the field of translation, so might be very basic questions. But what are the essential qualities of a translator? So, in this case, for example, Professor Pushpesh Pant translated this book. Does the quality of translation change if it is a person who's deeply familiar with China and then translating? Is there such a criteria for who gets to translate these books? And then the second question is, as a reader of all three versions of this book, did you end up with different sentiments as a reader? Yeah, those are the two questions. Thank you.
Nishit, would you like to respond now, or shall we take another question? Ambassador Rana has also raised this. Do you want to respond now? Yeah, please go ahead, Nishit.
Okay. So thank you so much, Shruti, for the question, and it's really something which we should actually ponder upon. So there is, if I say from the academic view, there should be essential qualities and criteria for translation, but we are living in an era of capitalism, so everything is driven by money and the contacts. So even Moyan wrote this, right, a small piece of change on request of a publisher who met in Italy. And why he met in Italy? Because even though his headquarter is based in Kolkata, Siegel books are actually based in New York and London. So that publisher can travel and make a contact with Moyan. Do we think any other Indian publishers who are actually facilitating translation are able to make a connection with a Chinese writer? To say it is difficult. And the criteria for translations, I don't think I am that much learned to give or put out some criteria. But I think first, for any literature coming from periphery, those who are not written in dominant languages meaning European languages or colonial languages, once often used by countries who are being colonized. So these languages has more money and more publishers, so they get to translate and publish first. And the second question about reader of three versions, yes, obviously, and maybe it is a different case for me because I know all the three languages. So when I am reading a Hindi text, uh, things like proper names and there are expressions which are different, like reading Chang Fei as a Bhim Ka Pahalwan would give me a different context. But yes, I enjoyed reading all the three texts.
Okay, Ambassador Rana, you've raised your hand. Please ask your question.
Thank you very much. I had no intention of entering the discussion, but I was prompted to do this because the thought came to me from Nishit Kumar's very comprehensive and very lucid analysis that he presented. And I compliment you in the fact that you stuck to time, which is not always the case at our events. Is there nobody among Indian scholars of the Chinese language who have turned their hand to translation? Is this an area that has been completely neglected by Indians who have studied the Chinese language? I mean, here is an interesting area available to somebody who has a literary bent, somebody who's interested in language. And I think this is something for someone to consider and pursue. That's my first thought. My second point is that I know very, very little of Chinese literature. But in my second year, towards the end of my second year of Chinese language studies, which I will not name the year, but it was long before almost all of you were born, with one or two exceptions, like my great friend Patricia, who was my classmate actually, or at least we were at the same language school. I read a book which I don't know if it is still known, if it resonates with anyone, but it was a very powerful novel of those years. I'm talking now, I have to name a date, of the early 60s. And the title of that novel of 500 pages was Yue Zhao Chun. Is that book known at all? Because I found it extremely powerful, because it narrated the story of a person who was in two minds, whether to join the revolution. Oh, sorry, I'm confused. It's actually a film. There is also a novel I read. I now don't remember the title. This is a movie, and it's called Yue Zhao Chun. It was released in 1965, early 1965, and it was released in order to be attacked. And that particular film was, in fact, one of the events that led into the launch of the Cultural Revolution. And Jiang Qing was supposed to have been behind it. And the film was released to be attacked and criticized. Wang Mingbao and all the other newspapers jumped into the fray. The first comments were reasonably positive, and then the tone changed, and that was part of the shift or the initiation of the Cultural Revolution. But sorry, I've digressed from the point I wanted to make, which is really that it is a great pity that in India we know so little about Chinese literature. And I want to compliment you, Nitish Kumar, for having focused on this area. And I hope this inspires some of our younger scholars to turn their attention to this field. Thank you very much. Mine is more a comment than a question, but I would appreciate your views in any case. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Nishit, I think you need to address Ambassador Rana's question before we go on to the questions in the chat box. Very first question, you need to address that.
Yes.
Do we have anyone who is translating?
There are Indian scholars who has read Chinese and translated Chinese literature into Hindi, English, and other languages also. But still, there is a lot needed in terms of bringing Chinese literature to India. I would not say there is none, but a huge gap is there. One of the reason probably is connections between Indian publishers and Chinese publishers. Second is what I feel is, apart from Shantiniketan, the history of learning Chinese language is still at a nascent phase. And probably in future, there will be more people who can enter to this field. And ma'am would actually give some names, but ma'am has translated, Deepak sir has translated. I've also read some short stories translated by Dr. Geeta Kochar from JNU. And I have translated a few short stories recently, which has been also published in journals, not just from China, also from Taiwan. And probably many more people will follow.
Okay. Shall we read out from the chat box? We have a couple of questions. We have a questions from Partho Mukhopadhyay. He's saying, thank you for an interesting take on this multilingual translation. How would this discussion differ depending on which novel of Moyen is translated, since his over is diverse, since his range of creativity and issues are diverse, content, theme. Yeah.
I totally agree with, the point made in the question that the discussion would be different. But I think it is less about the text and more about all the 2 or 3 text, the original text and the target text, because the whole discussion was on translation and the not issues, but reading of the translation, that what are different in all the 3 form of translation, 2 form of translation, English, Chinese, English, and Hindi. So English was translated by one of the renowned translator, and even the discussion will differ when it will be translated by some other scholars. And this is what even in this Prastavna, Uday Prakash made this comment that this has been done by a renowned scholar who knows IR and also a food critic, and a published author. So, and if somebody who has no knowledge of probably other things, and it will always be probably, it can be a good translation, it can be bad translation, it can be just a translation, relay translation. So the discussion will totally different in terms of text. the translated text. Just keeping in mind the original text will not bring the discussion.
Okay, there are two other questions in the chat box. Harita, will you read out the one by Shriyansh Mohanty? Harita, are you there?
Sure. Yes, I'll read it out. So Shriyansh Mohanty is a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies. So his question pertains to the interpretive challenges that arise when the source literature deals with critical or sensitive subject matter, be it ideological, historical, or cultural. How do the dynamics of translation shift when the text carries significant interpretive weight, and what additional responsibilities, ethical or otherwise, does this place on the translator?
Okay, thank you. And this is a very elaborate question. So it will depends on the language. If we are just talking about Chinese and Hindi, it will be a different context. But if we reverse the process that something is being translated from a language from periphery, Hindi, Tamil, and being translated into English, it will be different, create a different kind of responsibility and weightage for the translator. And it will totally dependent on market. The second thing is that the way I see any translation is good translation. Something is actually doing some work, it should be appreciated. And the way Moyan reacts to a question which I asked him that what is hallucinatory realism? Then he said, this is the work of critics to give me a box that what I write. But when I write, I don't see that I'm writing magical realism or hallucinatory realism or socialist realism. So this is the work of critics to see that how much weight and how much fidelity, how much ethical work has been done. Translator works end where he finishes his translation, and there is always a scope for improvement. Nothing will be a perfect translation. So that would be my answer for this question.
There are a couple of more comments in the chat box. Harita, will you read out something from Snigdha?
So Snigdha is asking you to please share the name of the journals where your translations of the stories were published.
Okay, the journal name is Anuvad. It is a Hindi journal and published by Bharatiya Anuvad Parishad. And I will share the other details with ICS.
So Partha Mukhopadhyay has said in follow-up where he's mentioning, when I visit the National Library in Beijing, my first learning was the vast range of translations of various technical and literary texts that were translated into Chinese. Is there a discussion in China about the quality or context of translations of Chinese books into other languages?
Yes, sir. There are discussions about quality and context, and there are academic journals coming on a quarterly basis, which talks about Chinese text being translated. And if we look at current situation, when in fact it started when Moya started publishing, just at that time after 1979, 80s, that now there are translation agencies who not only just assign the translation, it will edit, and they also establish contact with writers to translate. And these translation agencies are very much active in China. Almost all the authors, all famous authors have some one or other translation agencies, and academia discusses the quality. Context has also been discussed. In fact, like Arundhati Roy book was translated in Chinese, but a lot of time the discussion end up that they don't know that this is actually an Indian author's book because it was translated from English, and the author was labeled as a Western author. Such kind of very nominal discussion, but the quality of translation is also has been discussed.
There's one more question by Tarushri Srivastava, who is a master's student at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her question is, when literature is translated through a relay language like English before Hindi, Do you think this process creates a new voice or identity for the author? And if so, should we see this as a loss of authenticity or as a creative transformation?
Okay. So, thank you. It's a very good question on translation studies, and I would like to answer this with a reference to Moyan. So, it depends. First, translation is also a creative process. It cannot be just a ditto. It cannot give the same context as it is written in the original text, and it does give a new voice to the author. However, the process which is followed by Moyan and Howard Goldblatt, though there is a condition that both are alive, so they always, one writes and one translate in tandem with each other. They keep in touch, they discuss, and this is the way. If you look at different versions of Chinese novels of Moyan and English version, there are a lot of difference. Even chapters are being edited. Chapters has been rewritten also for publication in English. So these kind of transformation happens in terms of creating a new identity. Obviously, the whole journey of Moyan, he became more famous in as a Chinese author in West rather than in China. So yeah, these both the questions I hope I have answered.
Okay, so as of now, there are no other questions in the chat box, but is there any other questions from the floor? From the audience, that is. Okay, it seems there aren't any more questions. Nishit, would you like to make a concluding kind of a statement? Anything that the discussion has brought out and you would like to supplement with a few minutes of thoughts, of your thoughts?
So in conclusion, which is not just related to this particular presentation, but there is a need for more translation of Chinese, as all of us are more interested in Chinese and China studies. I think there is a dire need for translation, because unless you know the primary source, what Chinese are speaking in Chinese, one will not be able to know what Chinese are actually thinking. So if every time we go through a secondary source, somebody from US or Australia is actually translating, and then we are receiving it, we will always become a second-hand receiver. So for becoming the first-hand receiver of Chinese, not just literature, but Chinese thinking, Chinese philosophy, we need to have a first-hand experience.
Okay, a last, a second question or third question from Partho. Any thoughts on how more scholars can be encouraged to translate? I think
So,
you partly already sort of referred to the problems, but please do
okay. So
respond.
actually, I'm sorry, but this would be a blunt answer that money is needed. Because when people are learning language, so there are different phases we go through. One is a student phase, then a struggling phase, then some job, and then retirement. So those who are retired may take it as a hobby, but those who are in the struggling phase, they need their money, and those who are already having job, they need just an interest, which others cannot generate. So those who actually can do a more work in terms of time, they need money. The more money will be there, people will start translation and publication also. And this is a very blunt kind of choice to answer this question. Otherwise, those who are interested, they are doing their work. They are doing their work.
There are two more questions. Would you like to take them up? I'll say it out. Ma'am, you're on mute.
Please read out the question. Yeah.
Sure. This is by Manish Kumar from MP IDSA. How do you see the translation of Chinese military or defense document or material?
Okay, so the question is, I guess, half. See the translation of Chinese in which language? In English, there are a lot of very good translation, easy to translate. Even Chinese themselves, they also translate with some missing information. So, and I don't have much more experience in reading translated Chinese defense documents. And I will read this next question also. Is it more important for humanities, and can machine translation be sufficient for technical and scientific books and studies? Okay, so on machine translation, I would say the way AI is improving, they are doing pretty good job in terms of where nuances are not involved. But when nuances or emotions are involved, still they are lacking, and there will always be a need for human translation. Wherever AI will reach, we will need human too, because those machines are actually trained by human. So, and it will always keep increasing, even in terms of not just the language translation, in every field, I guess.
Okay. Anything more from the floor? No, it seems we have no other question in the chat box. So then let us conclude this Wednesday seminar by thanking Nishit for a comprehensive presentation, a presentation that has opened up many questions that we need to consider even in the long term for development of China studies in general, and in development of China studies in the realm of humanities in particular. So with that, I hand over to ICS. Is there a formal closing, or shall we just close?
Yes, I'll close. Thank you, Chair. With your permission, I'll formally close today's session. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, we sincerely thank Dr. Nishit Kumar for his insightful and thought-provoking talk, and Professor Shabari Mitra for guiding today's discussion and sharing her valuable perspectives. We also extend our gratitude to all participants for joining us and actively contributing to the conversation. We look forward to welcoming you again at our upcoming Wednesday seminar. Details are available on the ICS website, and you may subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you once again, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, Harita.
Thank you.
Thank you all.